Johnny Carson, let the silence go on, and it changed the room. On live television, silence is dangerous. Johnny Carson knew that. And yet, on a Thursday night in March 1974, when Dean Martin sat across from him and went quiet, Carson chose not to interrupt. The Tonight Show had a rhythm. Everyone in America knew it. Johnny asked the question. The guest answered. The audience laughed. The band played into commercial. 30 years of late-night television would follow that same pattern, but Carson built the blueprint. He was the master of timing, of control, of knowing exactly when to lean in and when to pull back. He could stretch a joke until it became something bigger than humor. He could read a room faster than anyone in broadcasting. And when something went wrong, when a guest stumbled or a bit failed, he could pivot with a single glance, a raised eyebrow, a perfectly timed line that turned disaster into gold. That was his genius. That was why the show worked. That was why 5 nights a week, 15 million people tuned in to watch a man in a suit sit behind a desk and talk. Dean Martin had been on the show more than 100 times. He was one of Johnny's people. Not just a guest, but someone who understood the machine. Dean knew how to play the game. He'd come out, sit down, tell a story, make a joke about drinking, flirt with the audience, and everyone would feel like they were in on something. That was the Dean Martin brand. Effortless charm, the man who never broke a sweat, who lived like the world owed him a good time, and he was gracious enough to accept. He'd been that man for decades. Rat Pack royalty. Films, records, television specials, his own variety show that ran for 9 years. He was American cool, bottled and sold, and America couldn't get enough. But that night, something was different. The show started normally. Johnny came through the curtain to Doc Severance's fanfare. The audience stood. He did the monologue, tight jokes about Watergate, about gas prices, about the state of the world in 1974. America was tired. The war was over, but the wound was still open. The president was circling the drain. People wanted to laugh, but the laughter felt heavier than it used to. Johnny felt it. He always felt it. That was part of the job. You absorb what the room needs and you give it back to them, repackaged, softened, made bearable. He'd been doing it since 1962. 12 years of reading the temperature of an entire country through a television camera. Dean was the second guest. The first had been an actress promoting a film that nobody remembers now. She'd been bubbly, grateful, easy. Johnny walked her through her talking points, got the laughs he needed, sent her off with a smile and a handshake. Then Doc Severinsen hit the cue, and Dean came through the curtain. The audience erupted. They loved him. He waved that signature Dean wave, loose and casual like he was greeting friends at a backyard barbecue. He smiled. He took his time crossing the stage, playing to every section of the room, letting them have their moment with him. This was his space, too. He'd been on this stage so many times that it almost felt like his own furniture. He sat down in the chair next to Johnny's desk, and the two of them locked eyes for a second. A recognition, an understanding between old pros. Two men who'd done this dance 1,000 times, who knew each other's rhythms, who could read the smallest shifts in energy. Johnny opened with the usual. "Dean Martin, ladies and gentlemen, good to see you." Dean grinned. "Good to be seen, Johnny." The audience laughed. That was Dean. Always the line. Always the charm. Always ready with the perfect thing to say that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They talked about Dean's show. They talked about golf. Johnny made a joke about Dean's reputation with a cocktail glass, and Dean played along, leaning into the bit, making himself the punchline, because that's what people wanted. He'd built an entire career on being the guy who didn't take anything too seriously, who floated through life with a drink in one hand and a song in the other. It was comfortable. It was safe. It was the formula. The audience was warm. The jokes were landing. Everything was going exactly as it should. And then Johnny shifted. "You've been doing this a long time," Johnny said. His tone changed slightly. It wasn't a setup for a joke. It was an actual question, the kind you ask when you're genuinely curious, when you're not performing. "Does it ever feel different now? The business, I mean, the work." Dean paused. Not long, just a beat. But Johnny noticed. The audience didn't. The camera didn't cut away. Dean looked at Johnny like he was deciding something, weighing whether to stay in character or step outside of it. "Different how?" Dean asked. His voice was quieter. The smile was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't the Dean Martin smile anymore. It was something more cautious. Johnny didn't rush. He could have filled the space. He could have made a joke, redirected, kept the energy light, but he didn't. I don't know, the pace, the pressure, the expectations. Dean smiled, but it wasn't the Dean Martin smile. It was something else, something more real, more exposed. "Yeah," he said, "it's different." Johnny waited. He could have jumped in. He could have made a joke, softened it, pulled them back to safe ground. That was his job. That was what he did better than anyone. But he didn't. He just looked at Dean and waited. Dean looked down at his hands. They were folded in his lap, and for a moment he studied them like he'd never seen them before. The audience was still there, but they weren't laughing now. They were listening. There's a difference. The energy in the room had shifted from entertainment to something else, something more intimate, more uncertain. "You ever feel like you're playing a part?" Dean asked. He wasn't looking at Johnny anymore. He was looking past him, or through him, or maybe at nothing at all. Like people know who you're supposed to be, and you just keep being that guy, even when you're tired of him. Johnny didn't answer. He didn't move. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. On live television, that's an eternity. In the control room, producers were probably reaching for buttons, ready to cut to commercial, to do something, anything to break the tension. The band was probably poised, waiting for the signal to jump in and save the moment. The audience started to shift. Someone coughed. Another person cleared their throat. The natural rhythm of the show had been broken, and everyone could feel it. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Most hosts would have saved the moment. Johnny didn't. He let it breathe. He let Dean sit in it. He let the audience sit in it. He let the cameras keep rolling. Because Johnny understood something that most people in television didn't. Sometimes the realest thing you can do is nothing. Sometimes the silence is the point. Sometimes you have to let the uncomfortable thing exist because that's where the truth lives. Dean finally looked up. His eyes were different now, heavier. There was something in them that hadn't been there a moment ago, or maybe it had always been there and he'd just stopped hiding it. "My son," he said. His voice cracked just slightly on the word. "Dean Paul, he's flying jets now. Navy pilot." Johnny nodded slowly. "That's something to be proud of." "Yeah," Dean's jaw tightened. He swallowed. "Yeah, it is." Another silence. Shorter this time, but just as loaded. The audience knew something was happening, but they didn't know what. They couldn't name it. All they knew was that this felt different. This felt real in a way that late-night television never felt real. Johnny didn't explain it. He didn't try to shape it into something digestible, something that fit the format. He just let it exist. "You worry," Dean said. It wasn't a question. It was a confession, stark and simple and true. "Every parent does," Johnny said quietly. He wasn't performing now. This wasn't the Tonight Show Johnny Carson with the perfect timing and the raised eyebrow and the ability to turn anything into a laugh. This was the man underneath. The father. The person who understood exactly what Dean was talking about because he lived it too. Dean nodded slowly. He looked at Johnny like he was seeing him clearly for the first time that night, like the desk and the cameras and the audience had all disappeared, and it was just the two of them. Two men in late middle age who'd spent their entire lives performing and were suddenly, briefly, not. "You got boys," Dean said. "I do." "Then you know." Johnny didn't respond with words. He just held Dean's gaze. And in that moment, the entire structure of the show dissolved. There was no audience. There was no camera. There were just two men, both fathers, both performers, both carrying weight they couldn't put down. Both understanding that the thing you're most afraid of, losing the people you love, is the thing you never talk about. Not on television. Not in public. Not when you're supposed to be the guy who has it all together. The director didn't cut away. Later people would talk about that. Why didn't they cut to commercial? Why didn't they go to doc or to wide shot or do anything to break the tension? But the director understood what was happening. Everyone in that studio understood. This was something rare. This was real. And sometimes in television, you just let the real thing happen, even if it breaks every rule in the book. Dean cleared his throat. He straightened up in his chair. The mask started to come back, piece by piece. You could see it happening in real time, the way a person rebuilds themselves after a moment of exposure. Anyway, he said, forcing the smile back onto his face. Enough of that. Johnny let him do it. He didn't push. He didn't try to keep Dean in that vulnerable place for the sake of good television, for the sake of ratings or memorable moments. He gave him the exit. He gave him his dignity back. "You got anything coming up?" Johnny asked, his voice light again, professional again, giving Dean the runway back to normal, back to the performance they both knew how to do. "Vegas in 2 weeks," Dean said, snapping back into character like he was slipping into a familiar coat. "You should come by. I just might." The audience laughed, not because it was funny, but because they were relieved. The tension broke like a rubber band snapping. The show returned to its shape. Doc hit a cue and they went to commercial. Dean stayed for another segment. They talked about golf again. They told a story about Sinatra. Dean did the voice. Johnny laughed. Everything was fine. Everything was back to normal, but it wasn't. After the show, Johnny didn't go to his dressing room right away. He stood backstage, still in his suit, still holding the index cards he'd barely looked at during the interview. The studio was emptying out. Crew members were breaking down equipment, coiling cables, shutting off lights. The audience was filing out into the Burbank night, probably already forgetting most of what they'd seen, holding on to the jokes, letting the strange moment with Dean slip away because it didn't fit into their understanding of what The Tonight Show was supposed to be. One of the producers came up to him, a young guy who'd been with the show for maybe 2 years. He looked nervous. "That was intense," the producer said carefully. Johnny didn't respond immediately. He was still thinking about Dean's face, about the way his voice had changed when he mentioned his son, about the silence, about the weight of it, about what it meant to let that kind of moment exist on live television. "He's scared," Johnny said finally. "Of what?" Johnny looked at the producer, really looked at him. The kid was maybe 28, too young to understand what it felt like to be Dean Martin's age, to have lived the life Dean had lived, to carry the kind of fear that comes with having everything to lose. "Same thing we're all scared of," Johnny said. "Losing what matters." The producer didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Johnny walked to his dressing room, closed the door, and sat down in the chair by the mirror. He looked at himself. The same face he'd been looking at for 12 years. The man who controlled every second of the most watched show on television. The man who made America laugh every single night. The man who could time a joke to the millisecond, who could read a room like a card sharp reads a deck, who never lost control, who never let the machine break down. And he thought about silence, about what it meant to let something just sit there, unresolved, uncomfortable, true. Dean Martin's son, Dean Paul Martin, would die in a plane crash 12 years later, March 21st, 1987, a military training flight in Southern California. The F-4 Phantom he was flying disappeared into the San Bernardino Mountains during a routine exercise. They found the wreckage the next day. Dean Paul was 35 years old. He left behind a wife and a son. He'd been a Golden Gloves boxer, an actor, a singer, a tennis player, and finally a pilot. He'd lived the kind of life that should have had decades left in it. When Dean Martin heard the news, people said he never recovered. He kept working for a while. He had to. That's what men like him did. That's what they'd always done. But the light went out. Friends said he aged overnight, that the man who had been untouchable, who had floated through life like nothing could hurt him, crumbled into something else. He stopped performing a year later. The Vegas shows ended. The appearances stopped. He became a ghost in his own house, wandering rooms in Bel Air, watching old films, drinking alone. And when he died in 1995, on Christmas morning, people who knew him said he'd been dying since 1987, since the day his son's plane went down, since the moment the thing he'd feared most finally happened. Johnny Carson didn't talk about that night in 1974 very often. He wasn't the type to revisit old shows, to dwell on moments, to pull out clips and reminisce. But years later, after he'd retired, after he'd left the spotlight for good and built a wall between himself and the public, someone asked him about the interview, about the silence, about why he didn't jump in and save it. There was nothing to save, Johnny said. Dean was telling the truth. You don't interrupt that. The person pushed, but it made people uncomfortable. Johnny shrugged. Good. Some things should. That's what people didn't understand about Johnny Carson. They thought he was the guy who made everything smooth, who kept the train on the tracks no matter what, who never let anything get too real or too heavy. And he was, most of the time. That was his job. But he also understood that sometimes the rails need to bend. Sometimes you have to let the machine break down for a minute so something real can come through. Sometimes the best television isn't television at all. It's just life, happening in front of cameras. That night with Dean Martin wasn't good television by the usual standards. It didn't go viral. This was decades before that was even possible. It didn't get written up in TV Guide as a great moment in talk show history. Most people who watched it probably forgot about it by the next morning. They remembered the jokes. They remembered Dean being Dean. But that strange, quiet moment where he stopped performing, that slipped away. That didn't fit. But the people in that room, the audience members who happened to be paying close attention, the crew who understood what they were seeing, Dean, Johnny, they didn't forget. Because for a few seconds the performance stopped. The facade cracked. And two men who spent their entire lives being who other people needed them to be got to just be. Dean walked off that stage and went back to his life. He did his Vegas shows. He smiled for the cameras. He played the part. He was Dean Martin, effortless and untouchable, the man who never broke a sweat. But something had shifted. He'd let the mask slip, just for a moment, and Johnny had let him. Hadn't exploited it, hadn't turned it into content, hadn't made it a bit or a story he could tell on future shows. Just held the space. Just let Dean be human for 30 seconds on live television. That's what silence can do. It can be a gift. It can be a mirror. It can be the only honest thing in a room full of performance. Johnny Carson knew that. He knew that sometimes the best thing a host can do is get out of the way. Let the guest be human. Let the moment be what it is. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it doesn't fit the format, even if it makes the producers nervous and the audience squirm in their seats. Television is built on the fear of dead air. Every second of silence is a second the audience might change the channel. That's the logic. That's the rule that every broadcaster learns on day one. But Johnny broke the rule that night because he understood something deeper. People don't just want to be entertained. They want to feel something. They want to recognize themselves in what they're watching. And sometimes the most recognizable thing is the thing we're all afraid to say out loud. The fear, the vulnerability, the mask we wear and how heavy it gets. Dean Martin was scared. He was scared for his son. He was scared of getting older. He was scared that the persona he'd built, the cool, unshakable, perpetually amused Dean Martin, was becoming a cage he couldn't escape. And for 30 seconds on live television, he stopped pretending he wasn't. Johnny let him. That's the story. Not the joke that landed, not the bit that killed, but the silence. The choice to let something real exist in a space designed to be anything but. The understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Years later, when people talked about Johnny Carson's legacy, they talked about the comedians he launched, the careers he made. David Letterman, Jay Leno, Joan Rivers, Jerry Seinfeld, they all got their break on The Tonight Show, all got the nod from Johnny that meant you'd arrived. They talked about the monologues, the characters, Karnak the Magnificent, Aunt Blabby, the swagger and the timing. All of that was true. All of that mattered. But for the people who really watched him, who paid attention not just to what he said, but to what he didn't say, there was something else, a quiet mastery of the space between words, an understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Let the silence go on. Let the person across from you be human. Don't save the moment. Let it save itself. That night in 1974, Johnny Carson did exactly that. And 30 years later, when he walked away from television for good, when he disappeared into a quiet retirement in Malibu and never looked back, people wondered why. Why would someone at the top of the game just leave? Why would the king of late night, the man who defined an entire genre of television, walk away without a farewell tour, without a big send-off, without milking every last second of fame? Maybe because he understood what Dean Martin understood that night, that you can only play the part for so long, that eventually the mask gets heavy. That silence, real silence, is a kind of freedom. That sometimes the most powerful choice you can make is to stop performing and just be. Johnny Carson died in 2005. He was 79 years old. By then, he'd been off the air for 13 years. He'd lived quietly in Malibu, sailing his yacht, playing tennis, staying completely out of the public eye. He'd turned down every offer to return to television, every attempt at a comeback special, every tribute, every interview request. He'd let the world move on without him. And when he died, suddenly from emphysema, the world realized it had forgotten how to see him as anything other than the guy behind the desk. When the news broke, people remembered the jokes, the characters, the moments that defined late-night television. But a few people, the ones who'd been in the room that night in 1974, or who'd seen the tape, or who understood what had happened between Johnny and Dean, they remembered something else. They remembered the silence, and how, for once, nobody tried to fill it.